Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Spring 2022 Change for Climate Lunchbox series. Today's session will introduce you to the basic principles of home composting, including how to get started, and how to maintain a home composter, and tips for troubleshooting. My name is Heather Wheelaker, and I'm here with my colleague, Karen Young. Karen and I both work in the Planning and Environmental Services branch with the city, and we're joined today by two colleagues from Waste Services, Rodney Al and Tina Kim, and I will introduce them shortly. Just a note that this session is being recorded. We will begin by acknowledging the traditional land from which we are delivering this session is Treaty 6 territory. We thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and Blackfoot. We also acknowledge this as the Métis homeland and the home of one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. It is a welcoming place for all people who come from around the world to share Edmonton as a home. Together, we call upon all of our collective honored traditions and spirits to work in building a great city for today and for future generations. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters. Today, we're joined by Rodney Al and Tina Kim. They work for Waste Services at the City of Edmonton and help Edmontonians start composting at home and keep composting at home. Welcome, Tina, and welcome, Rodney. Thanks for being here today. We're looking forward to this.
Thank you for having us, Heather. So as most of you guys know, Edmonton's waste system is moving to a 4-stream system. Most residents now have carts for food scraps and garbage, so the black carts and the green carts. Collecting organic waste separately makes it easier to process the organic components and put it to beneficial reuse through composting and digestion. This helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, creates green energy, and produces a valuable soil supplement, all while diverting more waste from the landfill. The food scraps cart also goes hand in hand with home composting. So when you're sorting out food scraps from your garbage can, this habit will be created, and hopefully this habit will be transferred when you're home composting.
And so today we're talking about what we can do with grass, leaves, and plants that occur on our property but outside of our house, as well as what we can do with those food scraps that come into our house and then they're inside things and we take them outside. And we're also going to, let's start thinking about that good, better, best hierarchy. Of course, when it comes to those grass, leaves, or plants or food scraps, there are methods that are good, there are methods that are better, and of course, things that we can think of as best of all. And so if I think when it comes to those grass, leaves, and plants, things that occur outside of our house but on our property, of course, yes, with the current waste system, if you've got a food scraps cart, I can put grass clippings into my food scraps cart. That's a perfectly good method to deal with some of my grass, leaves, plants. Then I can set it out for seasonal collection 2 times in spring, that's starting right away, and then 2 times in fall. Or if I have too much or I want to deal with it right away, I can take it to an eco station. Hey, Tina, how much does it cost me to drop off grass, leaves, or plants at an eco station?
$0 for free.
Free. And then of course, best of all, I could use grass clippings or leaves or my plant trimmings on my own property in a lot of different ways in order to feed my soil, amend my soil, and be beneficial to my little local ecosystem that's mulching, leaving the leaves, leaving the clippings, you know, and yes, composting at home. And then of course, when we shift over to things that come from inside our house, stuff from my kitchen, food scraps, yes, using my food scraps cart is good. It is better if I can compost some of that or all of that at home. And there are even some uncomposty kind of ways for me to deal with food scraps. I can, for example, dig it in like double digging. But best of all is for us to think about our food waste, only buy what we need, eat our leftovers, and avoid the wastage in the first place. which I think it's important as we start off talking about composting in general to talk, what is composting? So composting is just controlling rot. It is controlling decomposition. Composting itself is a very natural process, and we humans are just participating to facilitate that decomposition. We create an environment where the materials that are going to decompose, we can decompose them in a controlled manner that's less yucky and a little bit faster than what might naturally happen. Now, of course, I can do that on my property as home composting, or now the city has these different systems to do city composting on a larger scale. Dina?
So why compost at home? Why should we do home composting? Well, organic material like food scraps, for example, I have an orange right here, or yard materials make a lot of our garbage. In fact, it can take about 40 to 60% of our household's garbage, which is a lot. So it takes a lot of energy and resources for trucks to haul our garbage to the facilities. When the garbage is collected, the garbage also has to get transported to these buildings, and energy and power is used to facilitate the buildings and the machinery, which all make up a lot of energy. So when we're composting at home, we're eliminating the amount of garbage that we are setting out for the city to collect and the energy that is used to process the garbage or these organic materials. So not only do humans benefit from home composting, but also when we compost, the soil and earth benefits. So our soil benefits from organic material that break down, which provides nutrients. And I've listed many of the benefits here on the presentation slide. These benefits range from biology, chemistry, but all these benefits are related to the environment and the soil and plants. Next slide. So this is the most important part of our whole presentation. So if there's anything to remember from this whole session, this is what you should remember: greens, browns, water, and air. Heather, we're actually going to ask you to count how many times we say greens, browns, water, and air. So that was already twice. So if you can count throughout this whole presentation how many times we say this, and we'll check on later. But the 4 components here are the key parts to composting. And we will just watch a short video. I think Karen will share her screen with us.
The basics of composting is based on the 4 ingredients you put in your compost bin. These are greens, browns, water, and air. Greens and browns are the waste material you're adding. If you're a beginner, start by adding plant-based waste materials from your kitchen and from your yard. As you get more experience with composting, you can play with other things like meat and dairy, oils and fats, or weeds. But for now, stick with plants. They're easy. The only animal products you should be adding as a beginner are eggshells. If you want to put a little bit of yourself in, hair clippings, fingernails, and toenails add some spice to the mix. Water and air are the things that make composting happen. If your pile has stopped working, you've run out of one or both of these things. Make sure your pile is moist, not saturated. Fluff it occasionally to release carbon dioxide and let in oxygen. Composting is an aerobic process, which means it needs oxygen. Keep it aerobic by fluffing once a week, and while you fluff, break up the clumps and add some moisture to dry areas. When we bring these 4 elements together, we have a compost pile. Now let's look at how things work. Green waste is fresh and juicy. These are the peels, cores, and rinds and fresh grass clippings. Browns are old, woody material like onion skin, paper, or cardboard. Greens compost fast, and browns are slower. When you have a pile of moist greens, the fast decomposition generates heat. On the other side, when you have dry leaves and a bit of a breeze, you get a cooler decay. Think of the difference between the smell of a bag of rotting grass clippings and the smell of a forest. That brings us to the most important part. The forest floor smells great, especially after a rain when the browns, air, and water all mix together. The more greens you have in your pile, the more you'll notice a working smell. And a pile with too many greens is going to putrefy and stink. So by balancing greens, browns, water, and air, you'll know how to get the compost pile you want. Adjust the greens and browns to speed it up or slow it down. You don't need heat in the pile, but if you want it, add extra greens. Keep your compost pile covered with a layer of moist browns. This acts as a carbon filter, which will mask any odors in the pile, and it'll reduce flies a bit too. The finished compost will fall down to the bottom of the bin. You're in control of your compost pile, so try adjusting your recipe and have fun with it. If things go wrong, use these basics to correct the problem, and before you give up, call the compost doctors.
I think it does a really good job of highlighting this balance of greens, browns, water, air. And now I'm going to do the same kind of thing, but this is like the theory and the science that's happening in our compost pile. And if we can just balance those 4 ingredients and be thoughtful about it, we can have success with home composting. So as we've mentioned, these things that are greens, those things are fresh, they're moist. Let's see, I've got examples here. Look, I got this apple, I've got a banana, I'm gonna have a banana peel, I'm gonna have an apple core. Those are moist, they are kind of smelly, they will rot, they just wanna rot. And they also they're relatively high in nitrogen. Now on the flip side, I've got things that are dead, dry. Those are our browns. So let's see, I've got like a stick, another twig, I've got leaves, and how about this? Like newspaper. All of these are dry, they're dead, and they're filled with carbon. So we're balancing these greens that are high in nitrogen, that are moist, and the browns that are high in carbon, that are dry. And we're always managing that balance. Now, of course, I mentioned that composting is about controlling decomposition. So we're creating an environment where the microbes, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, they're doing the decomposition for us. And that environment needs water. All life needs a little bit of moisture. So we're looking to make sure that there's water or moisture in the pile. Some of that could be from the greens themselves. Sometimes I might add some moisture to keep the pile moist. And on the flip side, I want an aerobic environment for those microbes to do the decomposition for me. And aerobic meaning with oxygen. So when we talk about air, I'm going to let carbon dioxide out of the pile, and I'm going to let oxygen in. And as the video mentioned, we've got these 4 ingredients that we're constantly balancing. The greens and browns we add, and the water and air we have to balance. Maybe we add, or maybe we reduce. On this little chart, greens, browns, water, air, our greens and water will speed things up. They will also get things mucky. And yes, they could get things yucky. They could get things stinky. On the flip side, the browns, the shredded paper or the autumn leaves, those are dry. They smell nice. They smell like that forest floor, but they keep things slowly decomposing. They are like a brake. They slow down the decomposition of the high rot stuff. So we balance browns and air to keep us, to use that as like a brake to slow the compost down. On the flip side, the greens and water will speed things up. It is possible that if I flood that engine, like using the greens and water as like that gas pedal to really accelerate things, I could make an anaerobic environment without oxygen, and I'll just end up with a sloppy mess. So that's where we're balancing the greens, browns, water, air. Maybe I add some browns to balance with my greens, or I fluff the pile up to add air. Okay, well, I've gone on about that. Tina, take it from here.
Yeah, so what are greens and browns, as Ronnie has mentioned? So some of the greens we have are vegetable scraps, for example. This is not a vegetable, but, or fruit peels. This is an orange, and Ronnie had a bunch of apple. Oh, that's a pineapple. Or fresh plant trimmings is also a green. And some for browns, we have paper towels, dry leaves, straw, or I've got here some newspaper. I've also got some cardboard that's part of a brown, and also these are tiny leaves. I don't know if you guys can see. These are leaves that are part of browns as well. And for water and air, I'm sure we all know, so I will not try to explain that. But balancing these components is really important to composting. So what can I compost? We went over greens, browns, water, and air. But for those who are just starting to compost, or if you're telling someone else how to compost, we say anything from a plant. So you can compost or start compost anything from a plant. And continuing on, so what are some other things that we can compost? Now look at this list and identify something that is a mineral from this list. There's one thing for sure that is a mineral. It is not greens or browns. Yes, if you've guessed eggshells, you've guessed correctly. I can't hear everyone right now, but I'm hoping someone, oh yeah, Ronnie has the eggshells. Someone has guessed eggshells. So you can also compost eggshells because they're minerals.
Tina, let's do this exercise. Now let's look at this list again. I'll ask the participants, look at this list again, and I want them to identify everything that is those fresh materials, the greens on this list.
Things like vegetable scraps, fruit peels, tea leaves. Oh, I've actually got a tea bag. You can also compost tea bag. Coffee grounds if they're moist, and some plant trimmings as well would be greens.
Okay, now Tina, we're going to move on to a few things that need like special attention or can be a little bit tricky, just a little bit. So I've listed some here. Grass clippings. Grass clippings are something that people deal with often, or a lot of people deal with. Grass clippings are kind of interesting because they are green and they do want to decompose. But when I have a bag full of them, kind of like depicted here, they act like one mass. So as a clump, they can become one object all stitched together, woven like a material. And they, as a clump, will not have enough air in them. Or they could be just too moist. So when we're dealing with grass clippings, or even sawdust will do this, it clumps together when it's got some moisture. So we want to break these things up. Yes, it's true, nuts and seeds, rhubarb leaves can be a little bit more tricky, but all of these things can perfectly, you can compost them at home perfectly fine. I'll move on to the trickier items. Meats, dairies, oils and fats, it's true, weeds, disease plants. These are the most tricky things that we hear from people that want to compost at home. So our recommendation is, hey, as you're starting out, start with anything from a plant. Yep, I know there's weeds on here. Start with anything from a plant that you're willing to try. Invasive weeds can be particularly tricky. So don't get into these things early on. Figure out what you're capable of with your composting, find your comfort level, and then start trying some of these items in small bits. Of course, for these materials, these are fine materials that we can put into our food scraps cart. I want to point out that weeds, invasive weeds, we do want those to go into the garbage.
So there is lots of ways to compost, and your compost pile will depend on what kind of bin you use or what materials go into your compost pile. So there is lots of ways to compost, and compost piles are super diverse. So if you've seen one compost pile, or if you've seen a compost pile, you've just seen one. So as long as you're balancing greens, browns, water, and air, Heather, that's another one, then there is no wrong way to compost.
Collecting materials, Tina.
So when you're collecting materials for your compost bin or your compost pile, find a way that works for you. So for example, Ronnie and I have our compost pails here. We have two different ones here, but these work for me and that one works for Ronnie. So that find a way that works for you is a very important statement when you're trying to compost at home. Put your compost bin where it's easy for people to use so that you can encourage more people to use, or put organic material in your compost bin. And if it's pretty, more people will be more likely to use it. For example, Ronnie's compost pail is very cute. So if it's on your counter and it's visually attractive, it will encourage more people to use your compost pail.
Okay, so now we've discussed a whole bunch of different things about the general theory of greens, browns, water, air, and balancing those to facilitate the decomposition. To do that, that's the theory of composting. Now, there are lots of different, as Tina's already mentioned, there's lots of different styles, different methods. I've depicted several right here, and I'll run through these, but just know, and I will reiterate, you've got to find the right system that fits you, your preferences, your landscape, or wherever you're living, and of course the materials that you're adding, and last but not least, how you will use it. Okay, so in the far, what's that, on the right-hand side, we've got a conical one, a kind of cone. It's a one single bin. Yes, a lot of these bins happen to be black. There's no special magic about black. It's probably easier to manufacture. This particular model is called an earth machine, and I do see several of these around Edmonton. I've also seen square ones and rectangular ones. All of these are kind of a holding bin or static bin, as you can see on that first bullet. These work fine if you do it as batch composting. Batch composting is where I put everything in all at once and I kind of maintain it, and then the batch is eventually done all at once. Or I could do that as continually feeding into it. So I put materials like grass and plants and plant grass clippings and plant trimmings and food scraps in. I balance with those browns because I want equal parts browns and greens. And then I'm constantly maintaining, and eventually a portion of that static bin is going to be done. So that's continual feed versus batch composting. The next one at the top there, that's a tumbler, or like a rotating mechanism. This is a kind of a small version, but there are lots of different versions of tumblers. All those rotating bins or those tumbling composters are designed to help with that stirring, help with that fluffing that we do with our compost piles. They can be big, they can be small, and we've got lots of different examples that people can see at a compost school. Compost school is like our little demonstration site, which is right beside Fort Edmonton Park. Tumble composters are particularly good at that batch composting style. So putting all the greens, the balance of greens and browns in at once, and then maintaining that batch. They particularly help with that ease of turning it, fluffing it. And then, okay, so this big one at the bottom, that's a multi-bin. I mean, clearly this is 3 bins, but I've seen 4 and I've seen 2, and heck, you could have larger ones. Now, multi-bins, there's nothing particularly special or different about multi-bins, but you're looking at higher capacity and often more volume. This is particularly helpful if somebody wants a lot of compost, or they have a lot of material, or they really need to churn out a bunch of stuff, a bunch of compost in a short amount of time. Because a larger compost pile will compost more faster. In this graphic, they are showing how somebody could use one of the bins as the starter, and then I flip all the materials into the second bin, and then I eventually turn all the materials into the third bin. But I have also seen people use, okay, well, now we're adding materials into the first bin as a static bin, and now we're adding materials into the second bin as the static bin while the first bin cures. So there's multiple ways to do that. But all of those multi-bins are just larger. And that fits if you've got the space and the desire to do that much composting. And then last but not least, this bullet at the bottom is indoor composting. In indoor composting, there's a couple different ways. The most common that I hear about is worm composting. I also hear about people using this bokashi method, and I'll spell it out just in case somebody's listening. It's B-O-K-A-S-H-I, bokashi composting. And bokashi is a type of fermenting your food scraps in order to add them to the soil later. It's kind of a storage method, but it's popular for some people. I've also heard of really cool gadgets that you can get for your countertop that also kind of deal with some composting. But the point is that there are methods of doing indoor composting. I'll step back and say, once again, you can see lots of different methods of composting at home. We demonstrate those, of course, on our Facebook page, but also at our physical site, which is Compost School. And if Karen can put that in the chat, it's facebook.com/YEG Compost School, SCHOOL. But each of these is like, we've got to think of find a style that works for you, which takes us over to setting up a compost. How about that? When we're setting up a compost, it's really important to find the right spot. And it's most important that I find a spot that works for me and my family. Somewhere that's convenient, somewhere where I will regularly put materials in, somewhere where I will regularly maintain the compost. After all, I should be checking on those moisture levels, make sure that it's as moist as a wrung out sponge. I should fluff it about once a week. If I put the compost somewhere where I never go, then it's not going to compost. I'm just creating a situation where I'm going to get a bunch of stinky rot. And of course, that's called abandonment. So we want to maintain our compost. So think about a spot that's going to be convenient and well used. And in addition, you see this note about browns. You've heard that browns are important. So I've got to think, where am I going to get my browns that balance the greens? And where am I going to store browns so that I can balance with the greens? Tina, can I ask you to take over from here?
Yeah. So how maintaining a compost pile. It is important, as you mentioned, for greens, browns, water, and air to have equal amounts of greens and browns. So when you're adding food scraps, for example, or fruit peels to your compost pile, make sure that you're also adding appropriate amount of browns in order to balance those out. Also, as Rodney mentioned, we recommend you fluff the compost pile once a week or even once every 2 weeks. Just don't leave your compost pile alone for too long because you'll still need to incorporate air into your compost pile so that the materials in the compost pile can break down. So that's the air component. And for the water component, moist as a wrung out sponge. If you don't know how moist or how wet your compost pile should be, think about how wet a wrung out sponge is and put some more water, incorporate some more water into it, or leave your the bin of the lid of your compost bin for when it rains or when it snows. Hopefully it doesn't snow anymore, but when it snows, leave your lid and let the water get in. And it takes about 3 to 6 months to get finished compost in your bin or your pile.
Now we're speeding through things, but we should actually talk about finished compost. So of course, finished compost is gradually going to collect at the bottom of the compost pile or the compost bin. How people take out that finished compost kind of once again depends on their style and what they're looking for that finished compost. I should say that finished compost looks dark and rich, like, it looks like dark chocolate. And it's going to smell like that forest floor. It will smell like it's just like soil. Of course, it's not soil. It's organic material. It's humus. But it's not really going to smell like much. It smells like soil. If you're using a static bin, one can literally kind of dig it out from the bottom. If you're particular about the finished compost, then you want to look at the material itself and see, like, I will probably see stems from leaves, or maybe a twig, or maybe I'll find like an avocado pit or a corn cob. Of course, that depends on whether or not I put those in. But if I don't want that avocado pit or that corn cob, I can take them out. I can put them somewhere for mulch. That works for my style. Or you can put it back in the compost and let it decompose later. The point is, you can sift your compost if you want or not. As you dig it out, you will notice the quality of it. If you want to know if it's finished, so finished compost does need some curing time. That's stabilizing the amount of microbial activity in the finished compost. The plastic bag test is pretty common. So that's where I might take some finished compost, put it in like a Ziploc bag or a plastic bag and leave it overnight. If I come back to that plastic bag in the morning and it's puffed up, then I know that there's still lots of microbial activity going on in that material. There's still lots of breakdown to happen. So I'm going to leave that for longer so that it stabilizes and cures. If I come back to that bag overnight and I come back to it in the morning and it's not that puffed up, that means that most of that greens, browns, water, air has balanced out and it's nice and stable. And I can just start applying, which nicely segues into using compost. How about that? So finished compost, as I mentioned, it's this nice stable amendment. It adds nutrient, a light dose of nutrients to my soil. It also comes with lots of these properties like water holding capacity, and it comes with all that microbial life that's in it. So it's adding a dose of biology to my soil as well, which is to say that I need to amend finished compost onto my soil or with topsoil. So if I'm using finished compost in like a planter, the maximum I'm going to use is 1 parts compost to 3 parts, whatever the soil, the mix is, like planting soil. But most commonly, I might use it as a top dress. So I can top dress it directly on the soil, like a garden, flower beds, or I can top dress it on like a yard or a landscape. In all of these cases, slowly, the nutrients from the compost will leach into the top of my soil, into the organic layer of my soil. In addition, slowly but surely, the life in my own soil will come up and bring some of that material down. So that's like the microorganisms of fungi and bacteria, but that's also the macroorganisms like worms and maybe millipedes and centipedes. They will slowly bring the value of the compost down into the soil layer. And that's excellent for our soils, excellent for our plants. You know, I want to take a segue into something else as well. We've talked a lot about like robust composting and how to especially deal with composting food scraps and maybe something like plant material. But there are other methods that are almost like not composting. I call it uncomposting. These are things like leaving the clippings on the lawn, grass cycling. It's so little that it doesn't seem like I'm doing anything. And yet these are ways that we can deal with our grass, our leaves, our plant trimmings to support our soil, support our plants, support our biodiversity on our property. And it's almost like less effort. So, you know, I've got leave the clippings on the lawn, grass cycle. You know that the city's been talking about this for a long time, only because, you know, the academics and the industry professionals also talk about leaving clippings on the lawn. We also talk about mulching. You know, we want to cover our soils because bare soil is dying soil. There are ways that we could dig materials in, like trench composting. And of course, if you haven't tried it, we can keep a leaf pile. And that by itself becomes a different version of composting. It's called making leaf mold, but we can keep leaves either for our home compost or just making leaf mold by itself. All of these are dealing with lots of materials like grass, leaves, and plants in very easy ways.
And as we are just wrapping up, we want to emphasize this point. If you have food scraps, it's still good if to put it in your food scraps cart. It's still better to sort your food scraps out of your black cart, which is the garbage cart. The food scraps cart is meant for food scraps, but it is better if you have fruit peelings or organic matter to compost at home with it. Then you're reusing the nutrients that you have and providing more benefits to the soil and the environment. But best of all, is to actually avoid food waste in general from the start. So eat your leftovers or only buy what you need. If you buy more, or if there's so much food that you are throwing out so much, it's better to try to avoid leftovers or food waste from the very beginning.
And again, that applies also to our good, better, best kind of hierarchy when it comes to the materials outside of our house, on our property, grass, leaves, plant trimmings. So of course, yes, the city system can handle some of my grass clippings in the food scraps cart. Food scraps cart is intended for food scraps. That said, it's okay for me to put some grass clippings in my food scraps cart. It's even better if I set some of that material out for the seasonal collection 2 times in spring, 2 times in fall. It's even slightly better to take some of that material to the eco station. Tina, how much does it cost for me to drop off a paper bag of grass clippings?
$0 for free.
Free. Yep. And of course, it's best of all for me to deal with my grass, my leaves, my plant trimmings on my property for the betterment of my soil. That might mean I use my grass clippings for mulch. I might leave them on the lawn. I might rake less, so good for my lawn, or I might compost at home. And I feel like, Tina, we should say this one once again.
Greens, browns, water, and air. If you're at home, shout out with me. Greens, browns,
water, and air.
Should we ask Heather maybe how many times we've said greens, browns, water, and air?
I think we said greens, browns, water, and air, Heather.
I feel like this is a test. 5, 10, 15, 21 times.
Oh, we could have hit 30, Tina. Yeah, no. As long as we're balancing greens, browns, water, and air, then there's no wrong way to compost. Now, I will admit, Heather, that's a really fast tour through the basics of composting at home. The city does encourage people to compost at home as long as we're balancing those things and being thoughtful about our environment and what we're doing. Of course, if people have problems, they can contact us for help. So you can see here, we do have a web page about home composting. It's edmonton.ca/compost. You can subscribe to this cool little newsletter. Heather, we'll share a link in just a second so that maybe Karen or Heather can post it in the chat to subscribe to our Keep Composting newsletter. Just 4 editions per year to help people stay on top of what they're doing. Compost School itself is it's an interpretive site right beside Fort Edmonton Park. People can come down there and check it out and learn a little bit more about how they can compost in Edmonton. There's lots of different examples. And Compost School itself also has this Facebook page, which is facebook.com/YEG Compost School. And we do have a phone number and email address if people want to give us a phone call.
There are many ways to stay informed about the city's climate change work, so please be sure to follow us. And thank you again, my colleagues in Waste Services, Tina Kim and Rodney L., for sharing your time and your expertise and your humor with us today too. You've provided us with great information to get us started on home composting or inspiring some of us to continue with their efforts. And thank you, my colleague Karen Young, for handling all of the logistical pieces for today's session. And our audience, to you, I hope we will see you again at an upcoming session. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great afternoon.